Africa, sub-Saharan Africa's largest economy, has been removed from the global grey list maintained by the Financial Action Task Force, signaling its improved defenses against money laundering and terrorist financing. The watchdog credited South Africa's strengthened tools and regulatory framework, and analysts say the delisting should help ease capital inflows and reduce funding costs for the country. Professor Patrick Bond, a political economist and distinguished professor at the University of Johannesburg, joins me now. And good morning, Prof.
Great to be with you, Jana.
Yes. I know you've delved into this extensively. There's an article, out there that you have written. South Africa, Mozambique, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, all off this list. What does this signal? First of all, how did we get ourselves on this list? And what has changed between then and now?
Well, it's been a bit of regulatory strengthening, and all credit to, in our country, the Treasury, the Reserve Bank, some of the prosecution that's finally begun. But there are some asterisks. We have some very serious problems. Every single day, there's a new lead headline about police corruption. There's a major national investigation underway, a commission. And so that's why I'm surprised that last Friday, in the midst of this, and in the context of quite a few other international financial scandals like currency manipulation, or even our president's own use of hard currency of US dollars to fund the purchases of some of his cows at his ranch, which were done outside the general bounds of taxation and exchange controls. These are questions that are really, I think, bothering the society, because if you can get cleared from the Financial Action Task Force grey list and then have more financial flows into your country, well, you just don't know the quality. We've had so many problems with very predatory, hot money experiences in our stock market, a very highly overvalued stock market. The market capitalization of GDP is about the highest in the world, and a spate of corruption scandals that have made Johannesburg, where I'm speaking from, the most corrupt city in the world for corporations, according to PwC in its economic crime and fraud survey. So you see, there are going to be some quick questions about whether we actually deserve this, given we haven't really come to grips with some of these underlying problems of corporate corruption.
I mean, interesting, because we know this is being widely received positively, but you're providing a different perspective. Is this well-deserved? And I think that begins to call to question the credibility of the ATF. What do you have to say in that regard?
You're absolutely right to ask that question. The Financial Action Task Force, which was started back in 1989, took on much more importance after the 2001 World Trade Center bombings, the airplanes that were flown by some Saudis into two of the biggest buildings in the US, and creating havoc with the world financial system, not to mention over 3,000 deaths. And so the FATF really started to say, let's look at terrorism financing and drug money laundering, but it's illicit financial flows that are most devastating. And so people who are cynical, like myself, I know these systems quite well, we would say, well, if the Financial Action Task Force really had integrity, what about the City of London? I mean, anybody that knows what's happened to Nigerian wealth would look to London. And in fact, Sani Abacha's fortune was uncovered to some extent there. And secondly, Zurich. And maybe most of all, a place you may not have heard of, Wilmington, Delaware. It's close to New York City, and it's where international banks have their tax haven. So those three in Switzerland and in the UK and in the US are just not being considered as hot money or financial crime scenes, but we know they are. And so I would ask that question, first of all. Also, there's not much enforcement going on, and it's highly politicized. One of the most notorious places in the world for money laundering, which is the Dubai Financial Center at the United Arab Emirates. They were on the grey list, and last year were taken off, but it seemed to be just a matter of geopolitics. So I don't take this all that seriously. And, we didn't really see a strengthening of our currency, the rand. We didn't see inflows of capital. I think, people more or less take what the FATF says with a bit of the kind of cynicism I'm expressing.
All right, so it looks like markets didn't react as much to that news from last Friday. But, I mean, if we're calling into question the FATF, who then would be a credible watchdog for illegal financial flows? How do we contain it? Who polices that?
Yeah, look, in our government, we've had a serious problem. It goes to the Zuma government, but even the Ramaphosa government, because Cyril Ramaphosa himself has had experience with this illicit financial flows when he was the main figure in lawmen and getting money out to Bermuda for so-called marketing. That's one of those kind of illicit financial flows that the FATF should be on top of, and our regulators should be. But our central bank, our Treasury, they're part of our power structure. Central bank is owned by the commercial banks. They didn't do anything when it came to the financial manipulation of our currency, a notorious case that unfortunately the U.S. had to help in. I mean, I'm always a bit embarrassed to say, well, it was the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the U.S. And lo and behold, in February, just as soon as he came into power, Donald Trump said, well, we're not going to enforce that law anymore, foreign corrupt practices. But it was a crucial law for South Africans to increase watchdogging capacity over companies that rip us off, the most important being Hitachi on the two biggest coal-fired power plants, the worst case ever. And it was prosecuted in the U.S., even if not here. Now, if that means Donald Trump is not going to be any help, I think we have to turn to society. And then, Kenya has the best example, doesn't it? Gen Z, they were the financial watchdog when they asked for a debt audit and said, we have odious debt we shouldn't pay, and therefore we shouldn't be subject to fiscal pressures in 2024 and again this year. And I think it's society, it's your trade unions, your civic groups. There's a group called Tax Justice Network Africa. There's a campaign called Stop the Bleeding. So because the states are often in league with these corporates and especially the bankers who are pretty unethical, I think we're going to need more civil and maybe uncivil society out there doing the kind of protests that sometimes can sweep out bad governments if they are, as Nigeria has been and certainly South Africa is today, guilty of not managing their international finances.
So you're placing that onus on the people and civil societies. Like it or not...
And journalists too. By the way, journalists are crucial.
I can feel the burden.
There's a journalist consortium in Washington that really does a great job with the Panama Papers, with the Swiss papers. Here in South Africa with something called Gupta leaks around the Gupta family. So whistleblowers and journalists, wow, if we didn't have you, we'd all be in the dark.
Indeed. Now, whether we like it or not, this has happened. FATF has taken off 4 African countries from that grey list, and some are looking at the positive implications. So let's have you explore both negative and positive. Going forward, what are the implications of this removal from the grey list?
Well, because our countries in Africa have very, very high interest rates, I will expect more of the financial flows with fewer of the frictions, the checks and balances that do exist in the banking system when it comes to big sums of money deposited. But don't forget, that's hot money. So it's a positive for our balance of payments. You get more currency. But then we're also paying, in South Africa's case, about 10% interest rate on 10-year bonds. So it's a very high interest rate, say, compared to what you get elsewhere in the world, 1 or 2% in most of the European countries. And these are the sorts of differences that will bring in hot money. But it's called hot money for a reason. It comes in. And if our exchange controls are not being tightened, and if they are, we can lower the interest rates and make it less attractive and have a more effective local economy and circulate our funding here more effectively. As I said, we have a very speculative stock market. It's got huge rates of return, 30% increases this year alone, but a fixed capital strike. In other words, businesses aren't doing the investment in manufacturing and especially in the sort of plant and equipment and real estate that we would expect. They've got a lot of hot money that's floating around even inside the economy. So the pros and cons go with every relationship you have with every financier. And, sometimes you're going to go overboard, get into terrible debt. And Nigeria knows this from 2006-07, South Africa from 1985. And then you need some debt relief. And I think the society needs to keep asking the question, if that hot money is flowing in, if debts are being put onto the society, if things like fossil fuels, which really have a lot of liabilities, not just as assets for Nigeria, but they carry huge climate debt implications, well, then we've got to have society and journalists asking the tough questions, which are maybe the costs of international financial freedom outweigh the benefits of having flows of funds. And maybe we need to follow the great old British economist John Maynard Keynes, who said that desperately needed, above all, let finance be national. In other words, have exchange controls. And that way you can have lower interest rates and a more healthy economy.
I mean, definitely calls for the need to push this conversation further. But unfortunately, we don't have the time just right now on the show. But thank you. We do appreciate your perspective on this conversation. Professor Patrick Bond, political economist, distinguished professor, University of Johannesburg.
Thank you.
been a pleasure.